So watch how I do this. Ready?
Yeah.
Where's Dot right now?
Dot is at my mother's house.
And your mother's house is in?
My mother's house is in our hometown, where I've stayed for the last 3 weeks, called Vineland.
Yes.
Deep in the south of New Jersey. It's... and actually, I'm the one who wanted to talk about this. And part of why I wanted to talk about Vineland was because of Progresso's, the food company, their television campaign. I have friends all over the world. I have friends all over this country, more so. And in the last year, I have gotten so many Facebook messages. Oh, I just saw your hometown on a Progresso commercial.
Right.
And it was really weird because, you and I, we only live 2 hours north.
Mm-hmm.
We live in very, very different circumstances from where we grew up.
Absolutely.
I think your current home is at least a little bit closer to your childhood home.
Mm-hmm. That's because all of the childhood furniture, all of my family shit is surrounding us right now.
That too. But I live in the complete and total opposite.
Yeah.
I live now in Jersey City, very much in a low-income to moderate-income urban neighborhood. Not as bad and dangerous as some parts of Jersey City, but certainly not where the money is. Certainly not, gun violence free.
Well, let's put it this way: 3 or 4 blocks down, and shit's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where you live.
Absolutely,
it's not far.
No, not far at all. 3 or 4 blocks
That's
in
for
both
real.
directions.
The gunshots and the stuff going on in Jersey City is daily.
Yeah, two blocks away is the closest the gunshots have ever rung out from my own apartment. But where I grew up, also in Vineland, was extraordinarily rural, extraordinarily farmland. And Mark did not grow up. Mark like that. Mark grew up in Center City, Vineland.
Pretty much, yeah.
And so nice homes, nice blocks, but pretty close to the violent areas of Vineland. And that's the weirdness of Vineland. And this is all part of the baggage that you carry when you're from New Jersey. It's in the 80s, it was the armpit of America, and everyone talked about that. And everyone's impression of New Jersey comes from flying into Newark Airport and seeing all the refineries with their smokestacks, pouring fire out of them high up in the air. And so they have this idea that the entire New Jersey is extraordinarily industrialized. Well, that's just what they see when they fly into Newark, whereas New Jersey itself is the Garden State. Mm-hmm. And for good reasons. My mother's freaking gardens are amazing.
Pine Barrens.
And I can tell you they are amazing because I spent the last 3 weeks weeding them. And it is. It's in the bottom of the Pine Barrens. It's a resource-rich area for incredible farming. Absolutely incredible farming. The best produce I've ever had came out of my mother's backyard. Mm-hmm. And the second best produce I ever had came out of the other farms in Vineland. They had just been picked a day or two earlier than what came out of my mom's backyard. And the third best produce I've ever had is everything I've ever eaten in Paris. And that's the ranking. So Vineland is this weird place.
But people from North Jersey, when you tell them I'm from South Jersey, most of the
let's back that up. When you tell anyone, once upon a time, when you told someone you're from New Jersey, they're like, oh, what exit? And I never got that joke when we were growing up because we didn't live on a highway.
Right. It takes us 30, 45 minutes just to get to...
Now it does.
Yeah.
When we were growing up, it took 2.5 hours to get to Philadelphia because the main highway, Route 55, that gets us the fuck out of Vineland, wasn't open until 1994. Right. They started building that when my mother was 10 years old. That was 1962. It took them 32 years to build a fucking highway.
It's amazing.
That's when they leveled my mom's neighborhood for Route 55.
Oh wow!
Because she lived out in South Vineland, right? Where my family's company is. She lived across the street from that. Her house and 4 houses down remained, and then the rest of her neighborhood was the rest of her street because there was no neighborhood. It was all forest or farm around them.
Right.
But it was a street lined with houses for several miles, and just that, and no outlets off of that. Sheridan Avenue and whatnot, that's still pretty new. And all of her neighbors moved and left, and almost all of the houses, 4 houses down from her, were all eminent domain for this
Amazing.
highway when in 62 when she was 10 years old. And again, they didn't finish the full expanse and open it to connect that part of New Jersey to Philadelphia and to the Atlantic City Expressway and everything until 1994.
Yeah, what
the
the
year,
hell is that about?
It just took them 32 years to build a highway.
Wow.
That's the year I got my driver's license.
Well, there's still no... I said this in the last podcast when Pepe was here, because we were
I love Pepe.
hating on Vineland then, too.
Well, he lived in my neighborhood in middle school. No, in high school. We rode the same bus.
But there's still no direct train line that goes...
No,
from
there
north
once
to south.
was.
There was?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. This
Really?
is how my family got to Philadelphia and to Camden for their shopping. Because, when you wanted to go a little bit past... I'm trying to remember the name of the department store. My grandmother worked there as a bookkeeper when she was a teenager and in her 20s. It was a department store on Landis Avenue. It closed... sometime late in our childhood. You know
Newberry's?
the one. Newberry's,
Newberry's.
yes. My grandma, it closed when we were, I guess, early teens.
Uh-huh.
My grandmother was their bookkeeper
Wow.
in the late 30s and
That place
and
was
40s.
around for a long time. Yeah.
Much longer than my grandmother.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And my grandmother lived very close to that, and that's another story of Vineland. But, where was I?
Darn it. I'm supposed to keep track of these things.
Damn it. This is what I do.
Shit. It was a complete and total...
Oh, when you wanted to do your shopping, yes. The, the train line out.
The train lines, yes.
Yes. You know where the train runs down the boulevard.
Mm-hmm.
That used to run all the way to Philadelphia.
Really?
Yes. And it was used both for public transit as well as industrial. In our lifetimes, that train route has only been industrial, but that train route is actually how my family's business, back when my family's business was first a feed company and then a coal company,
right.
That's how they got their supply. If you're going down Main Road, you go over what used to be railroad tracks. Well, when I was a little kid, a train used to go down that railroad because I grew up next to those railroad tracks. Yeah. And every now and then the train would fall off its tracks and fall on top of my father's office. Literally, there was one day he's in his office and the train's going by and suddenly he hears crack and he's on the phone and he turns around and the train is literally now like coming towards him and it rests on the building.
That's hilarious.
My father's office is a 100-year-old chicken coop.
Oh my goodness.
The 100-year-old, it's older than that actually, 110, 120-year-old chicken coop? Yeah, it held up the weight of an entire freight train once. Several times, actually. My father just happened to only be in it at the time once. Yeah, he used to wake me up in the middle of the night when it would go by in the middle of the night. But yeah, that was all, that branch of the train joined up with the main branch of the train, which used to run all the way through Camden, Philadelphia. And in the 1960s, when my uncle, who lived in Center City, Vineland, in my family's home there, it's been in my family for almost 100 years now, when my uncle went to college at Rutgers Camden, he took the train. He couldn't afford a car. He certainly couldn't afford gas to fill the car. He came from absolute poverty. His father died in World War II. His mother was raising him as a single mother all those years.
So you get to Camden from Philly. You got to go to Philly first?
Oh, no. You go through Camden, then on to Philly.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
Camden's just like the last stop before Philadelphia. On that train that no longer exists.
Now you have to go to Philly first.
Yes. Unless you take the bus. You can take the bus, and the bus will run you through Camden before it runs you into Philly.
Right.
And that's something my family has also been doing recently for those who work in Vineland, or live in Vineland and work in Philadelphia. And that can be anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours by bus.
Yeah, I've done it once when my car died.
Yeah. It's brutal.
The bus back down, yeah.
And that's sort of what I want to talk about, is this weird microcosm of Vineland that, for so long was so far away from urban life, from Philadelphia life, from, the closest city that was, considered the epicenter of culture. And I had Philadelphia family that all in time relocated. I had Rittenhouse Square family, had a townhouse in Rittenhouse Square. That all over time either died off or moved to Vineland over the last 150 years. And it's this very weird thing that Vineland is so far removed and from advanced culture, let's say, or high culture or high art. I'm not sure how to say this without being offensive to someone. That Vineland itself being sort of in the middle of nowhere, and having three towns that are neighbors, but no neighbors.
Well, that's what I was going to say earlier, though, is when you talk to people from North Jersey, they don't know that area exists.
Not at all.
Their idea of South Jersey is they'll say, oh, Tom's River, or sometimes Burlington. Have you been down...
Burlington, to me, growing up, was North Jersey.
Exactly.
And it's so very much in South Jersey.
It is South Jersey, but it's northern South Jersey.
And the biggest primary difference is that starting in Cherry Hill, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
You start in Cherry Hill, you move on to Mount Laurel, you move on to Burlington. There are plenty of very impoverished
Cherry Hill's the other one here. South
areas.
Jersey, Cherry Hill.
Yeah. And to me, that was always North Jersey because that's where the money is. And Vineland is very much not where the money is. It's where the beautiful gardens are. It's where the best produce is.
Okay, so why do you think that is? Well, this has been an issue that anybody that's from there knows. We've known this about Vineland. Yeah. They've tried.
There has been industrialization that has come and gone.
The redevelopment of Landis Avenue, kind of.
Oh, that's what
would you call that? A failed experiment, or
barely an attempted experiment?
Okay.
They didn't do nearly as much as they could have, but that's also wrapped up in Vineland politics. But let's back up to why Vineland? What the fuck?
Yeah, why even talk about Vineland?
First off, because it is both urban and rural, and as such, it is still warring the same race wars and class wars that started with the riots of the 1960s. They've never ended in Vineland. They've been going, and they're much worse now than they were even when you and I were in high school. And it's been happening because there's gang violence and farms. Because where else in this country do you find urban and rural, gang violence, and farm country,
right,
all rolled into one municipality, into one city? You don't find that anywhere.
A city with the largest square footage of any city in Jersey.
Yep. Not the largest population, but you're right. The largest square foot. I believe it's 16. Not square foot. Square mile, man.
What did I say?
Square foot.
Square miles.
69. I know. Square miles is the size of Vineland's footprint, and it is the weirdest place in the world. And it's been getting a lot of attention, for better or for worse, through this Progresso commercial.
Yeah, what
but it is
the
about? Weirdest place in the world, and that's what I want to sort of like demystify and unpack.
Okay.
Do you want to start with why Vineland? How did Vineland start? What the fuck is it? Or do you want to start with the Progresso commercial?
I'm just curious about the Progresso commercial.
Okay, so a year ago,
Progresso's headquarters is in Vineland.
Sort of.
Okay.
Sort of, and that's been some of the controversy that's emerged over the last 6 months as a reaction, where other Progresso towns have gotten pissed off that Vineland's getting all the attention. It's like, oh, come on, bitches, please. Progresso's headquarters, I don't have the full history of that company. There have been times in our lifetimes when Progresso didn't have anything in Vineland, where they sublet their factory facility out to other companies. For instance, Goya. Or in the more appropriate Puerto Rican pronunciation, Goja. And being from Vineland, you hear both.
Yes.
Because of our Puerto Rican population there, and its own diversity even within a very complex Puerto Rican population.
Absolutely.
Contingency in Vineland. Progresso has maintained at least land holdings, but it hasn't always been based in Vineland, and it certainly has other factories where they make decent food all over the country, and in fact all over the world, depending on how you want to sort of like parse out the consolidated corporate structure of it. Right. But certainly other Progresso factories in this country, and I'm not sure about actually branded Progresso factories outside of this country, but for instance, Ohio. And again, other towns have gotten pissed off that Vineland's getting all the attention. Then Progresso's like, oh, well, we're going to release a whole series of commercials featuring the different towns. It's like, oh, you pansies.
Sure.
Backtracking. And I think the reason why they wanted to do that was because Progresso has not been the most successful food company over the last however many years.
That's
and
true.
As any corporation has to do now and then, all corporations go through this. They have to, by the way, I'm a musician. That's my job. So, yeah, take this all with a grain of salt, but I'm also like an amateur sociologist and I can't shut my brain the fuck up. So, again, take it with a grain of salt.
You know a lot about what you know.
I try. My curiosity is endless. Why Vineland? Because Progresso, from my estimation, Progresso was trying to save its company, as all companies need to now and then, and they decided the best way they could do it in this market of holistic this and organic that and everything else was to show that their food came from real America. And Vineland serves as both urban and rural. It has the urban and industrialized environment that can support their function as a corporation. It has also the farmland to get them the produce and protein sources, chicken, etc., that they need to actually make their food. It's an all-in-one package. And also the tax laws are really, really favorable to companies down there at the moment. More so than in the rest of Jersey in so many ways. But that's why Progresso, and that's why the commercial, is because they're A, they're trying to save themselves, and B, they thought the best way to do it is to show freshness. And to sort of brag about being associated with this town that has a history of producing incredible eggs and vegetables and fruits and chicken meat, i.e. chicken.
So, is this commercial? I assume it's a skewed version of Vineland.
Oh yes, it's highly romanticized. It's extraordinarily colorful. I mean, it's practically Technicolor. The green pops out of that commercial.
Vineland's
so
a beautiful
much.
place.
In some places, and you know, it vacillates like everything else.
Yeah.
Even whole neighborhoods vacillate and have vacillated in our lifetimes. But it's highly romanticized. You know, it's that typical food commercial where someone breaks, I'm literally demonstrating with my hands right, breaks the corn in slow-mo, the corn cob. No corn is grown in Vineland, by the way, but breaks the corn cob, and maybe a little is, I don't know, actually, I don't think it, no, a little is, and like the little dewdrops coming from the core of the corn cob sort of like splinter off into air and hang there in slow-mo, and then you cut the commercial to the tomato that has dew all over it, and it just looks so romanticized. And I'm sorry, I go to the farm markets with my mother, and none of the produce is covered in dew. It's too fucking hot. The humidity is not that high, though it is high right now. And yeah, it's highly romanticized. Of course it is. It's commercial. It's designed to sell you something. It's not designed. It's not a documentary. If it was a documentary, the colors would be considerably more gray and considerably more degraded.
Right.
And it would be impossible to shoot anything with integrity without finding a boarded up building in your screen. And that's the reality of Vineland. Its infrastructure is tragic. Its leadership has always either been completely and totally corrupt, just like the rest of New Jersey and Chicago, and Baltimore.
Also, it's educational leadership as well.
Oh,
that's a whole
elected school board.
Yeah, that's a whole.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. The Vineland BOE
that I have to tiptoe carefully around because I have family that are.
Well, we don't have to go there now.
Yeah, employees of the Vineland Board of Education. But Vineland, it's. Well, let's talk about where it came from.
Yes.
It was a very intentional town. It was we would call it now. It was built by a developer. They didn't call it back then, but it was built in the 1860s, just before and further developed into what it became during the Civil War. During that very, very horrific period when the country was chopped in two and we only had half the land that we started with, and there was a massive war when hundreds of thousands of Americans murdered each other. An absolutely ghastly, horrible chapter. This guy named Charles K. Landis, who, you know, when we were growing up was purported as this great visionary, turns out he was one of the most corrupt assholes ever to walk the soil of this already corrupt state. He was a developer, and he was developing towns. Mm-hmm. And he would get 1 square mile blocks of land granted to him by the state, and then he would turn that 1 square mile town into something appropriate for the resources available. So, for instance, Sea Isle City, one of the nicest shore towns in southern New Jersey.
Where I spent all of my summers at the shore. Was
Sea Isle City was built by Charles K. Landis.
Wow.
It started as a 1 square mile town granted to him by the state of New Jersey, and he developed it into a resort because the beach is right there. It's one of the earliest resort towns built in New Jersey.
That's amazing.
Which built most of its wealth out of resort towns for Philadelphians and New Yorkers. Vineland, very much, a 30-minute drive from the shore if you're going 60 miles an hour down country roads in the middle of the forest, which is extraordinarily dangerous to do, but we generally do 70.
It's fun.
It really is. Trees are flying by you, and you know you're going to hit a deer and die any second.
And there's actually a Route 666 down there somewhere.
There is. It freaked me out growing up because I grew up Methodist. A huge Methodist contingency in Vineland. But Vineland, given that it was so soil resource rich, Charles K. Landis built it as a center city area surrounded by farmland that was unaffiliated with Vineland itself. Because he didn't know how to build a farm community. You don't build a farm community. Farm communities develop organically.
Okay.
They have for thousands of years of much longer than thousands of years of human history. That's just how humans live with each other communally.
Yeah.
Once they develop this concept of we can barter for our goods and don't have to cover all of our base needs by ourselves, house, food, and clothing.
Right.
That's how towns, farm communities, rural communities, that's how agrarian societies are built. They build themselves organically. But Charles K. Landis saw what was essentially an extraordinarily sparse country farm community with very, very fertile soil and decided to build a small little tiny city in the middle of it to see what would happen. Essentially, it was almost a social experiment.
This is crazy.
And by my estimation, it is a social experiment that is, of course, as they all do, both succeeded in surprising ways and failed in very deadly ways, in very caustic ways, in very horrific ways. So it was established and built in the 1860s. If you can imagine, for I think it was a good 60 years until at least the 19 teens or the 1920s, Landis Avenue itself, at least until the 19 teens, that was a dirt road.
Yeah.
It had many of the buildings that it currently has. They all look very different.
Right.
But Landis Avenue itself, named for Charles K. Landis, the main drag through that 1 square mile, framed on either side by East Street and West Street, and further gridded by a number system, 1st Avenue, 2nd Avenue, 3rd Avenue, or 1st Street, 2nd Street, whatever it is. That 1 square mile had the main drag, which served as all the stores and shopping, was surrounded by homes for people who supported that main drag.
Yeah.
And then the farmers had access to that through horse and buggy. And my family at that time, so we're talking a good 100 years plus ago, they were all farmers. My family were not immigrants in the 19th century, as much of Vineland's population is.
My grandparents are.
Exactly.
And they had a farm.
And we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
My family, on both sides, by all estimations, has been in this country for 300 years. I am the epitome of WASP. And my family has been in South Jersey for 300 years.
Wow.
My people have been farming and making glass products in South Jersey for 300 years now.
So we're the dirty immigrants that came over.
Well, and let's talk about that.
Yeah,
because that's where the story gets interesting. And that's where the story gets important, because somewhere in this, it's a microcosm of the entire of the American experience, in a very microscopic way, and it's a microcosm of all of the pain of the United States.
Ooh.
It really is.
That's deep.
So this is how Charles K. Landis pulled all of this off. It was a sparse farming community, not enough to support this 1 square mile city. And he had more land, Vineland Township, not the city of Vineland, Vineland Township, the surrounding farms and unclaimed lands. He had everything unclaimed granted to him, and some of it claimed, eminent domain over to him. There's a long history of eminent domain in Cumberland County as a whole. And that's also a horrific history. And so he needed to find farmers. Well, Charles K. Landis was a really good student of history. The English colonized the United States, the eastern seaboard specifically, because you could get more ports that way, so you could have more shipping that way, which is how they were able to beat the French out of so much of the United States, which is why the French were our allies during the revolutions, because they were as pissed as the English as we were. And of course we screwed them, but we'll say that for another podcast. The way the English made that effective, and this is where my ancestors come in, is in the early 18th century. So we're starting talking in 1703, hitting its apex in 1723, and concluding at 1763. The English needed to put people into the colonies. But it didn't make any sense for them to send their own people to the colonies, because that would just dilute their tax base. They wanted to build their tax base. And meanwhile, there's all sorts of nasty wars and famines going on in northern, we would now call northern Germany. Back then, it was areas of Prussia, and it was northern Germanic city-states.
Okay.
Lots of war, lots of famine. This coincides with the invention of the tie, which we'll save that for another podcast.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, it pisses me off. Ties just piss me off.
Oh, me too. That's why I'm curious. But...
Teaser, look what happened to the Prussian army. That's why we should not wear ties. They invented it. Why are we still wearing it? Does Prussia even exist anymore?
Yeah.
No.
Oh my God, that's even crazier.
Yeah, we'll get there. So the English really more or less invaded with spies that area of Prussia and the Germanic city-states to convince people to move to the new colonies. And they paid for those Germans, let's say, for all intents and purposes, and Prussians, they paid for their passage and helped them get set up in the new world. That's why there's such a strong German contingency in this area and in this country at that time. And that's also why the Germans, at the beginning of the Revolution, the Germans here in the United States sided with England before they sided with the colonists. And it took Washington a number of years during the active war to convince the German settlers to switch sides to the colonist side.
Interesting.
And again, this is where my family comes into this. So my family's been farming that area since long before all the other families came. Yeah. But you need to increase your tax base. You can't pull from other areas of your tax base, which would be the entire United States. So Charles K. Landis in the 1860s and 1870s started going to Italy. He actually hopped on a ship and went to Italy with a translator to convince Italians, because Italy was in such horrible political condition, and there was so much starvation, especially in southern Italy, going on, that they were an easy mark to convince. And for some of them, he assisted with their passage to come to the United States. And since he was granted so much land, he did a rent-to-own system, or leased, or if possible, sold his land to the Italian immigrants.
Amazing.
And that's how the Italians got to at least South Jersey, and certainly to Vineland. To Vineland first, and then they spread out to the rest of South Jersey from there. It's because Charles K. Landis, who built this city and needed to make it work, went there, went to Italy and pulled all these people in. And that's when he realized this is what Vineland is for. He didn't know this when he first built it, but he came to understand when the Italians started coming, is that Vineland is an immigration city. It is a place for people from other countries to come and learn gently how to live in the United States.
You know, it's funny because I view Vineland as the place that I was sent to learn gently how to be like a human being.
Well,
on some sort of
cosmic level?
On some cosmic level.
Okay, that's fair.
Before you can move to this level, we got to send you to Vineland, because there are lessons you can only learn by having...
And there's something there about surviving Vineland and either getting out or staying in Vineland.
So it's a place to start for immigrants.
And it's a great place to grow up for some people.
Oh yeah.
For now,
we were talking about the influx of Italian immigrants.
First Italians, which is how your family got here, and honestly, most of my high school crushes, their families as well. And that evolved in the early 20th century, and became a couple other things, and a couple other cultures coming to Vineland in small amounts. Ukrainian, but much of the Ukrainian was much later.
All my neighbors, the blacks.
Yeah,
And I don't mean blacks as in the color of their skin.
that's their last name.
Well, that was their last name. That
They were part of the early Ukrainian immigration. But in 1946, immediately after the end of World War II, well, a year and change after the end of World War II, the move of Puerto Rican immigrants began. And that's when the real diversity problems start. But I don't want to undermine the earlier immigrant issues because we have to start working in the KKK now. The KKK, of course, being a very ridiculous and expansive social movement in this country for a couple centuries now.
Now, is this mostly through the 50s with the KKK?
No, 20s.
The 20s?
It ended in the 20s.
Oh,
the KKK considered the Irish and the Italians to be as black as the African Americans.
Well,
so the KKK,
Sicilian,
you're even worse. Yeah, there's no hope for you.
Right.
So the KKK would rally throughout the Northeast against Irish and Italians, and in the early 20s, I believe it was 1922, but don't quote me on that. The KKK was having a rally. The entire city government was all WASP. None of my family. My family was never that prominent. At least not before that point. But all WASP nonetheless, and the KKK was rallying against the Dagos. That used to be the pejorative term for Italians. And the Italian, KKK had been getting away with rallying against all sorts of people for a long time, but the Italians were not having it. And the Italians stood up and beat the shit out of the KKK. 1922. Beat the ever-loving shit out of the KKK. And the next day, you can see, the mayor, the town council, all of, the prominent businessmen, they're all in bandages, walking with crutches, and it was so obvious.
That's epic.
It was
hilarious.
Very epic. And here is what used to be the best policy the KKK had. For all of its existence until 2006, the KKK had a firm rule. They had a list of towns where they had been defeated. And every member of the KKK is given that list. And the rule is for KKK members, you do not go into that town. You do not cross the town or city's borders. You do not support their stores by going to them. You have nothing to do with that town. And when I lived in Indiana, I lived in a town where the KKK had rallied against the gay population in the 1970s, and the faggots and dykes rose up and beat the shit out of the KKK in the middle of and pardon me using those words, but it's in the 70s.
Oh,
it's
please.
the most apropos for the
We all know what
the population in the 70s.
Exactly.
And the KKK were no longer allowed to go into Bloomington, Indiana. The problem was their main headquarters was 20 minutes south of Bloomington, Indiana. And to get there, you had to use a highway that ran through Bloomington. So to not use that highway to get to the main headquarters of the KKK, you had to drive an extra hour out of your way. And KKK members are supposed to do this. Well, starting in 1922, I believe it was, the KKK were no longer allowed to go into Vineland. And so there were no more KKK rallies in Vineland until the year 2006 when the KKK,
Right, I was going to bring this up.
as an organization, rolled back that policy and that list. And I was visiting, I think it was Megan's family, on Main Road.
Name dropper.
You're gonna have to. I was trying to be specific. You're gonna have to cut that out.
Sure.
I believe I was visiting Megan on Main Road. She was back from where she lives in the Middle East, in the Midwest. Family, I do too much cultural work.
Yeah.
And it was right there on Main Road, and there was a KKK rally going by her home, which is only 2 miles from my parents' home on the same road. And they had come out of Millville, where the KKK were still very active throughout our childhood.
Yeah.
But not in Vineland until 2006. And later that summer, I visited Indiana for one of my primary mentors' retirement party, a professor to whom I'm extraordinarily devoted and appreciative of her. And outside of her retirement party, the KKK was throwing a parade and a rally by Indiana University. And it was very disheartening to see that both in Vineland and in Bloomington again, because to me, the KKK being defeated in my two first homes, Vineland by the Italians, and I'm not Italian, but I always had a great love and appreciation for the Italians of Vineland because they were very much my neighbors and certainly my childhood crushes.
Well, they had a hard time when they first got here.
Oh, they had a horrible time. Yeah. Horrible time. Rampant poverty, rampant disease, and certainly cultural... what do we call it? Appropriation problems?
Yeah.
But this gets back to what Charles Landis built. When he realized he had built an immigration town, it's a place for immigrants to come and gently, gradually immerse themselves into America, to adjust, to, not resistance is futile, assimilate. There we go. I needed Star Trek to get me through that one. Yeah. To assimilate to American culture. And the anthropological and sociological models apply brilliantly, backwards, obviously. That, an immigrant comes to the new world and, old grandma, she never learns to speak English, but she makes her children go to school because for the first time they have access to a standardized public education, and their children, their sons especially, if we're talking about the Italians, they go to school and they learn to be businessmen, strong, and innovative, and they speak both languages, their home language and their national language, and they're bilingual from birth. And then they have children who only speak English and pat their grandmothers on the heads, and their families were extraordinarily successful because they went to school and they studied business and they established themselves as standards of the community, of the business community, and their children go off and be artists and teachers.
Yeah. And then you've got the middle class.
Yeah, and all their kids are artists and teachers who can't pay their bills.
Well, that's the story of my family.
That's the story of my family.
My great-grandparents had the farm,
yep.
And then there were my grandparents who helped out and had their blue-collar jobs, and my mom was the first one to go to college.
Yep, my family too. Same story. And it's interesting that your family and my family had the same story when my family's been here for 300 years and your family's been here for 4 generations.
Right.
But they both landed in the same area, just separated by 180 years.
It's amazing. I didn't realize you guys went back that far.
Early 1700s.
I mean, I had the experience of, so I did grow up in Center City, Vineland, and then moved out to East Vineland for the last 4 years I was there.
But you were an adult when you did that.
Yes.
You grew up in Center City, a nice part of Center City, Vineland.
True, right. One of the oldest parts.
Yes. And the dividing line is perfectly summed up by my own grandmother. My grandmother, again, her family's been here for, by the time she was born, 200 some odd years. German, strong German stock, and English, but we don't talk about that. Her father was a farmer. Her mother, after her father died, maintained the farm, mainly a chicken farm for eggs, and they had a really hard time establishing themselves. And her uncle, who never had children, was very much a second father to her and her siblings. And her uncle had established himself in business and was doing pretty well for himself in a farming business. And he bought a farm in Vineland Township, not too far from Center City, Vineland, that his sister and her husband rented from him. And that's where they raised their family. And my grandmother moved there when she was 3 months old. And she spent her entire life in that house, on that property, from the age of 3 months until she died at the age of 86.
Wow.
And when her family moved there, it was rural. It was a farm. And it was a farm that you had to take a horse to get into town to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And she went to church at First Methodist in Center City, Vineland, because that was closer than South Methodist, which had been built for the South Vineland farmers. And that was her life. And by the time she died, same house, same land, she had been living for 40, 50 years in Center City, Vineland. She never moved, but Vineland moved. Vineland evolved. In the 1950s, Vineland Township was incorporated into Vineland City, and the whole thing became the city of Vineland. So my father, when he was 5 years old, got his first street address, and the zip codes came later, And when my father was 5 years old, his address went from being Vineland Township to City of Vineland, and really just in short, Vineland. So that was a small change for him, but for my grandmother it was a massive change because that began the urbanization of her own neighborhood.
Right.
And that's when houses were built across the street, and eventually a pharmacy, which is now a restaurant. And that's when the apartments went in 2 doors down, the apartments that became the ghetto for Vineland, the first ghetto for Vineland, for minorities and for the lower classes, we now call them the working classes, the extraordinarily impoverished. And therefore, when the gang violence started in the 1960s, it started 2 doors down from my grandmother,
Wow.
who had already lived in that house for 40 years, most of that being a farm.
Wow.
And that's what I'm talking about, this dichotomy, this microcosm of Vineland. It is typified by my grandmother's experience of having grown up rural and died urban, spending half of her life in one, half of her life in the other, while never leaving the house.
Well, that experiment is still in progress to this day, right?
It is still.
Vineland is still serving that original function.
Yes, it ran out of immigrants in the 1940s, so it tapped into Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. For many, many decades, there was a sign in the airport in San Juan that advertised, "Come to Vineland."
Right.
That was a fabled sign in our childhood. It was real. I don't think it's still there. But the primary immigrant since 1946 has been Puerto Rican, with more Ukrainian, more and eventually Korean, some Chinese, very little Chinese, but mostly Korean and some Chinese, and a healthy dose of Russian Orthodox.
So why is Vineland in the state that it's in now? Why is it degrading? Why has it never built itself up culturally? Why has it connected itself?
Because we left.
Oh, us as in everybody who has left.
All the third and fourth generation people leave. They've learned how to live in America. They can no longer handle living in the confines of Vineland, the borders of Vineland, so far away from the civilized world, the culturally advanced world, Philadelphia, New
York City, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And they realize they don't have to stay. They left for college, and they don't have to come back. So, unlike my sister, who did come back.
Well, that's what I was going to say. What about the ones who stayed? I mean, I have friends down there. They have beautiful properties. They have kids and families, and
they maintain the tax base of Vineland. They fill the businesses when their ancestors retire. They take over the leadership of Vineland, mm-hmm. and that's been an interesting sort of sociological study. What is the last name of the mayor? What vowel doesn't end with, or what consonant doesn't end with? It was always WASP until the 1980s, I believe. Was the first Italian mayor?
Was that Romano?
Yeah.
Yeah, Romano.
Yeah, I believe so. So the Italians had been in Vineland for 100 years. Before the first Italian mayor, before the first Italian descended person had gained in his esteem enough to win over the voters of Vineland. What does that tell you about the voters of Vineland?
Well, yeah.
They hold on to their prejudices for a long time. They'll eat the Italian food. My uncle still can't handle garlic, but that's another story.
Oh,
actually, it's not another story. There was just so much anti-garlic everything in America in the 1920s to the 1950s, and he sort of grew up in that. Text message.
I was wondering what that was.
That was the original spice, not the text message, the garlic.
Yes.
That was the original spicy food of America. Was garlic, it's so spicy, please. But that was still considered spicy when I was a child by my family. Garlic was going fancy. Because my family was so old world. But now their current mayor, his last name is Bermudez. Yep. He's the first Puerto Rican descended person, and he is actually by birth Puerto Rican, to ascend to the mayorship. And his tenure as mayor, as much as it's being complained about, me looking from the outside back and maintaining a tie but not living there, I can tell you it's the reaction to his mayorship. It's been the same exact reaction to every other mayorship of Vineland, which is they're doing everything wrong. It's all bad. And Bermudez, he's being blamed for everything that's going wrong, because it's his job as mayor to do that. And, his Puerto Ricanness is being cited in hushed tones because you don't say racist things. Well, it's the same thing when Romano was mayor.
Yeah.
And I can remember members of my family who used to bitch complain about Romano. And there would always sort of be a veiled reference to the fact that he was Italian. And now those same exact family members look back wistfully and miss the Romano years with a slight tear in their eyes.
Well, those are the people that...
Your memories are so short.
The people that complain about Obama for that same reason,
Yes.
that inherent racism.
And again, this is that microcosm.
Yeah.
And so why is
Fascinating.
Vineland in the state it's in? It's always been in that state.
State of limbo.
A state of limbo, a state of holding pattern, a state of not growing.
Right.
Because not enough people stay there long enough to build it culturally. It maintains itself industrialized with the urban poor. It maintains itself rural with the farming poor. It maintains its business class on a larger footprint than it did originally, because now it's the entire city of Vineland. My family's business started as a feed company almost 100 years ago, and is now an energy company.
Amazing.
It's the same chicken coop that my great grandfather bought in 1926.
Yeah.
It's the same railroad tracks that were there for the most part more than 100 years ago. But as times have changed and as community needs have changed, the business has evolved to meet the bare needs of that.
Yeah.
But if we're talking cultural, if we're talking the things that make a community really a thriving community, the development of new art and therefore new thought, Vineland doesn't have that, because that only comes out of the third and fourth generation of an immigrant family.
Right.
Or in my case, 3 or 4 generations after you all arrived. So 300 years after my ancestors arrived.
Understood.
Vineland just didn't, that was a different in the United States. And that's another podcast
Absolutely.
that I've already planned. Yesterday at my computer, as a matter of fact. But we left. We are not actively teaching and creating in Vineland. We went where our new ideas could find collaborators and could find people who could accept new ideas, people who embrace new ideas. For you, new story, new poetry, new philosophy. For me, new philosophy, new music, new theater. Not necessarily in that order for either of us. We left, though. If you look at the theater scene of Vineland, they're doing the standards. They're doing good works. There's an active community theater with some really wonderful people involved. There's always been an active community theater in Vineland with some really wonderful people. And they license shows from MTI and the other companies. And they do the same shows that every other community theater throughout Middle America does.
Yeah.
But Vineland's not in Middle America. Vineland is a 45-minute drive from Philadelphia and a 2-hour drive from New York, where anyone can go and see new theater in New York or see just off-Broadway theater in Philadelphia. They're not doing those shows. They're doing Bye Bye Birdie.
I meant to ask you before, and I'm sorry I'm going off topic, but wasn't Vineland below the Mason-Dixon line?
Technically, yes. Vineland is below the Mason-Dixon line, because the Mason-Dixon line is the border of Maryland and Pennsylvania, and that is the part of New Jersey that does fall further south than the southernmost border of Pennsylvania.
And people say that about South Jersey, that it has this very southern quality to it.
It does, but when you say, oh yeah, I grew up below the Mason-Dixon line, people scoff at you. You're from New Jersey, oh! Right. Well, it does have this very southern quality to it. It does have a massive race problem. And Vineland and Millville both, bordering cities, very different from each other, both have very large black populations.
Right.
And so the primary urban poor is Puerto Rican and black. And any time in any city where that combination exists, you have race wars. That is Newark. That is Brooklyn. That is the Bronx, more so than Brooklyn. That is Chicago. That is Detroit.
When did we have the riots in the 90s? The Landis Avenue riots?
Oh, I don't remember exactly what year. Was it 92?
Probably. And I don't even remember what started it, but I remember there were riots on Landis Avenue. They trashed some stores.
I think it may have been a combination of two things. It was a reaction to Rodney King, which does make it 92.
Yeah.
And it was
So
also...
posers.
Yeah, well, angry people.
Yes.
Angry people finally feeling like they had well, it was a fuse waiting to ignite.
Sure.
And also the year before that, President Bush, during his campaign, Herbert Walker, I should say,
Yes.
in 91, did a rally on Landis Avenue.
I was there.
I was behind him because I played in the marching band.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so...
I remember then having just the bare minimum knowledge of politics and the world and what was going on, but I knew enough to know that he was a fuck.
I was with you on that, although we didn't actually know each other yet.
No, right.
Not really. We'd barely even met.
I don't remember actually how we met.
Oh, we had a class.
Oh, is that what it was?
Okay. We just sort of like grew into each other.
Right.
That's a whole other... We'll save that for like the 12th podcast,
right.
The Origins of Kevin and Mark.
We get deep into the personal stuff.
Oh, God help me. But that's the basis of the race riots, and that's yet one more piece of the microcosm of Vineland being such a representative model for the entire United States. Is the race riots, is the urban poor, the industrialized poor, and also the farm community. You know, Vineland was able to save itself from a plight like Detroit's because it had its farming community within its borders. Mm-hmm. Vineland was able to save itself from a plight like Newark because it had its farming community within its borders. That's what has saved Vineland all of this time. Otherwise, Vineland would have been gone and taken over by the state decades upon decades ago, as Newark has been, as Camden has been, as right now we're waiting to see if Governor Christie ever takes over Atlantic City. God, I hope not.
That was going to be my question is, I always felt that there was some sort of North Jersey conspiracy where all the wealth and the industry and the resources seemed to concentrate up there, and that it was almost intentional, that South Jersey was intentionally kept.
Accidental. And I'll tell you why. It's an accidental of the two great cities of New Jersey. New Jersey has two great cities. They are big, they are boisterous, they are phenomenal, they are not in its own state. You thought I was going to say Newark and Camden, didn't you? No, you didn't think
Almost.
that. No. It's New York and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
The two great cities of New Jersey are New York and Philadelphia.
Right.
Which city is bigger? Which city has more money? The one bordering North Jersey.
Yeah, so it just happens to be that way.
So that's why North Jersey is so much more Democratic, whereas South Jersey is so much more Republican. Mm-hmm. That's why North Jersey has so much more wealth, and that's why the wealth of South Jersey is chiefly relinquished to the suburbs, Cherry Hill, Mount Laurel, where people take the Patco train into Philadelphia to work, or the Jersey Shore in only certain parts.
That's why we say North Jersey and South Jersey.
Yes.
Even though there is technically a North Jersey, a Central Jersey, and a South Jersey.
Technically. Well, and also we have to throw in there, for most of New Jersey's history, it was actually East Jersey and West Jersey.
See, this is why I love having you here, because
that's so fucked up.
You know so much more than I do.
Well, just the whole East-West thing, it never made sense to me, but that's also why New York and Philadelphia ended up being the way they were, was because West Jersey was associated with Philadelphia for its entire expanse, which, again, makes no sense, and East Jersey was associated with New York, and those cities grew, whereas Camden and Jersey City, the sister cities on the other side, did not grow.
Right.
And that is also so much largely because those two cities are the main cultural centers of their respective states. Mm-hmm. Whereas Jersey City bifurcated itself with two cities that were sister cities and also therefore economically competitive cities with Philadelphia and New York. And those two cities, Camden and Jersey City, had to both grow within the same state structure, whereas Philadelphia and New York were able to influence their own state structure from afar for their own needs.
Huh.
Yeah. So what else about Vineland?
The point is, we got out. You got out much earlier than I did. What was your primary motivation?
I had to go someplace to be a gay man.
Right.
And so I went to the only college, my parents deny this now, but I went to the only college I was allowed to go to, which is the college that my sister was currently at, which was Indiana University. And I'm in many ways glad I went there. In many ways, I know of a different college that would have been much more appropriate for me, but can't change it. And there was a lot of damage done to me at Indiana because it was conservatory and it's brutal and it's designed to basically shred you of all sorts of, human dignity and any sense that you are, acceptable in any way, so that you will basically be able to survive a lifetime of critics telling you are shit. And to this day, I can handle a lifetime of critics telling me I am shit. Because I went to Indiana, but I had to go to the middle of the Midwest, to KKK country, in order to be a gay man.
Yes.
And then the next problem is, my sister went there for music education. She went there to learn to teach. And that's why she was able to go back, was because there was work waiting for her, and eventually she found what is a very painful, extremely exceptional job, and she does the best job of it of anyone who's held that extraordinarily esteemed and extraordinarily painful teaching job, that position. It's an exalted position in the system, and it's an important job that she does. And she had that opportunity because she learned to be a teacher, and her need is to teach, and she has done that, and she was able to do that in Vineland. So that's how she was able to come back. But me, I learned to be a writer.
Yeah.
There is no new music in Vineland. And new music, on the whole, in the United States, is looked upon with disdain by the vast majority of the population, who are completely and totally ignorant that it even exists. And when they hear it, they just think it's noise, or they have a nasty reaction to it, or whatever. It's fine. We can talk about that on another podcast, education and whatnot, because it's the other side of what I do. But there is no way for me to have any sort of voice or expression for what I know how to do in Vineland.
Right.
I did my MFA in musical theater writing, and there is no new theater in Vineland. There is, the high school just did Mary Poppins a year ago. That's new theater. It's great, but Rodgers and Hammerstein could have written it. It's not Fun Home. It's not Color Purple. It's not everything Lin-Manuel Miranda has done. And they can't get an audience for that material in Vineland. If you're in Vineland and you want to see that, you have no problem going to New York City. But when I moved to New York City, it was really sort of traumatic to some of my family. And the rest of my family just sort of hid their trauma, because when you're from Vineland, or at least as long as my family is from Vineland, you don't leave Vineland.
Don't leave, right.
You don't leave Vineland.
It broke my grandmother's heart.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and my grandmother understood that I needed to go, and she understood without being a scholar herself, but just being a very wise woman, she understood that generational thing where the fourth generation has to leave.
Yeah.
They have to go and do something someplace else to realize their full humanity, whether it's because the last three generations are still alive and still running the show, and they need to go learn how to run the show without the other generations looking down on them and constantly correcting them, or it's because they have new ideas that just aren't going to market in Vineland, right, in that kind of community that is both urban poor and also rural poor.
Well, and that just connects to that's a larger story of you leave the quote-unquote small town and you go to the big city, yep, and you make something of yourself.
Or you fail and you move back.
Right.
And I'm waiting every day to just fail and move back.
I mean, that's why talking about Vineland is important to me, because in the beginning I said, why even talk about Vineland? But that's the theme. The theme is, for me, what you're saying is I didn't start growing as a person. I feel like I didn't really come into full adulthood until after I left there.
And by left there, you mean when you left there, not when you were in college.
Oh, no, college, because I came back. I had the chance to stay out and copped out and came back.
You were a Vinelander the entire time you were in college.
Yes, absolutely.
I was not.
Right.
I was a gay man.
Yeah.
And that became my identity.
That was your split, right.
And that allowed me to adopt a new identity to fill in the indoctrinated Vineland identity. So I would at least have something I could say I was. Because I was no longer, the moment I said, oh my God, I'm gay, that's when I realized I could no longer be a Vineland. Well, I will say this. I remember the night that we went to that diner on Delsey Drive.
Oh, yes. I remember it clearly.
You were wearing a dark gray hoodie, as you so often do.
Hair, a complete blob mess.
And
I was a mess.
You were.
Yeah, I was at a very low point.
And I was okay with that, but I was wondering which direction you were going to go.
Yeah. You had asked me if I had thought about coming up there, and then you called me a few days later. it was so. It was.
I'd only just moved up there a year before.
I know, but your intention was so. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but you're like, look, they're looking for a resident advisor or whatever it was. You were trying for me.
Yeah.
You hadn't seen me in years. You saw me at the diner, and then a few days later, you were following up, which meant something. I mean, it didn't go anywhere, and I didn't.
It did go somewhere. You are a tenured teacher at a charter school.
Oh, good lord! Just the just realizing it, going through that realization, like, yep, that's what I do.
Yes, that's not who you were when we were at that golden pigeon thing.
Well, that's certainly true. Yes,
and now
nevertheless.
you have
Damn right.
a sense of grounding that's coming from this family that is evolving with you now, and that is something that guy in Golden Pigeon on Delsey Drive was not capable of.
Well, that guy can't ever go back. I mean, I could
Oh,
visit. I could go down there and visit, but I can't walk in the house I grew up in.
Well, and that's just it. You no
Right.
longer have any ties to Vineland.
Exactly.
My family has every tie it's had for at least 100 years, and some of them for longer.
Yeah.
And my family is still all down there.
Yeah. It's a very strange feeling, but in a way, it's good because it means I can only move forward, and I can just look back.
And for me, it's good because when the city has beaten the shit out of me again and again and again, and when my students have beaten the shit out of me again, as they did this year, and when the noise gets too much and the drama gets too much, I can go to my parents' house where it's quiet, and I can relearn how to be a Vinelander. Because I think for me, as I'm approaching middle age, very gracefully, I think what is now my job for myself is to learn how to be Vineland for myself in the city.
That's some wise shit right there.
It's to learn how to have that sense of quiet in a very noisy industry, in a very noisy profession, in a very noisy environment. I do well with chaos. I thrive on it, but only to a degree.
Yes.
And Vineland is the place where I can go and relearn what I knew growing up, so I can refresh and bring it back
Yes.
to where I am.